Boshin War, the whole story, narrated straight from Wikipedia, start to finish. Let's dive in. The Boshin War, Boshin Senso, sometimes known as the Japanese Revolution or Japanese Civil War, was a civil war in Japan fought from 1868 to 1869 between forces of the ruling Tokugawa shogunate and a coalition seeking to seize political power in the name of the imperial court. The war stemmed from dissatisfaction among many nobles and young samurai with the shogunate's handling of foreigners following the opening of Japan during the prior decade. Increasing Western influence in the economy led to a decline similar to that of other Asian countries at the time. An alliance of Western samurai, particularly the domains of Choshu, Satsuma, and Tosa, and court officials secured control of the imperial court and influenced the young Emperor Meiji. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the sitting shogun, realizing the futility of his situation, abdicated and handed over political power to the emperor. Yoshinobu had hoped that by doing this, the house of Tokugawa could be preserved and participate in the future government. However, military movements by imperial forces, partisan violence in Edo, and an imperial decree promoted by Satsuma and Choshu abolishing the house of Tokugawa led Yoshinobu to launch a military campaign to seize the emperor's court in Kyoto. The military tide rapidly turned in favor of the smaller but relatively modernized imperial faction, and after a series of battles culminating in the surrender of Edo, Yoshinobu personally surrendered. Those loyal to the Tokugawa shogun retreated to northern Honshu and later to Hokkaido, where they founded the Republic of Ezo. The defeat at the Battle of Hakodate broke this last holdout and left the emperor as the de facto supreme ruler throughout the whole of Japan, completing the military phase of the Meiji Restoration. Around 69,000 men were mobilized during the conflict, and of these about 8,200 were killed. In the end, the victorious imperial faction abandoned its objective of expelling foreigners from Japan and instead adopted a policy of continued modernization with an eye to the eventual renegotiation of the unequal treaties with the Western powers. Due to the persistence of Saigo Takamori, a prominent leader of the imperial faction, the Tokugawa loyalists were shown clemency, and many former shogunate leaders and samurai were later given positions of responsibility under the new government. When the Boshin War began, Japan was already modernizing, following the same course of advancement as that of the industrialized Western nations. Since Western nations, especially the United Kingdom and France, were deeply involved in the country's politics, the installation of imperial power added more turbulence to the conflict. Over time, the war was romanticized as a bloodless revolution, as the number of casualties was small relative to the size of Japan's population. However, conflicts soon emerged between the Western samurai and the modernists in the imperial faction, which led to the bloodier Satsuma Rebellion 9 years later. Etymology. Boshin is the designation for the 5th year of a sexagenary cycle in traditional East Asian calendars. Although the war lasted for over a year, Boshin refers to the year in which the war started. The characters can also be read as Tsuchinoe Tatsu in Japanese, literally elder brother of Earth Dragon. In Chinese, it translates as Young Earth Dragon, which is associated with that particular year in the sexagenary cycle. The war started in the 4th year of the Keijo era, which also became the 1st year of the Meiji era in October of that year, and ended in the 2nd year of the Meiji era. Political background: early discontent against the shogunate. For the 2 centuries prior to 1854, Japan had a strict policy of isolationism, restricting all interactions with foreign powers, with the notable exceptions of Joseon Korea via Tsushima, Qing China via the Ryukyu Islands, and the Dutch through the trading post of Dejima. In 1854, the Perry expedition, led by Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy, USN, opened Japan to global commerce, initiating rapid development of foreign trade and westernization, in large part due to the humiliating terms of the unequal treaties, as agreements like those negotiated by Perry are called. The Tokugawa shogunate soon faced internal dissent, which coalesced into a radical movement, the Sano-joi, meaning revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Emperor Meiji agreed with such sentiments and, breaking with centuries of imperial tradition, began to take an active role in matters of state. As opportunities arose, he vehemently protested against the treaties and attempted to interfere in the shogunal succession. His efforts culminated in March 1863 with his order to expel barbarians. Although the shogunate had no intention of enforcing it, the order nevertheless inspired attacks against the shogunate itself and against foreigners in Japan. The most famous incident was that of the English trader Charles Lennox Richardson, for whose death the Tokugawa government had to pay an indemnity of 100,000 British pounds. Other attacks included the shelling of foreign shipping in the port of Shimonoseki. In 1863 and 1864, these actions were successfully countered by armed retaliations by foreign powers, such as the British bombardment of Kagoshima and the multinational Shimonoseki campaign. On 20th August 1864, the forces of Choshu Domain, together with Ronin, raised the Hamaguri Rebellion, trying to seize the city of Kyoto, where the emperor's court was, but were repelled by shogunate forces under the future shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu. The shogunate further ordered a punitive expedition against Choshu, the first Choshu expedition, and obtained Choshu's submission without actual fighting. At this point, the initial resistance among the leadership in Choshu and the imperial court subsided. But over the next year, the Tokugawa proved unable to reassert full control over the country, as most daimyos began to ignore orders and questions from the Tokugawa seat of power in Edo. Foreign military assistance. The shogun had sought French assistance for training and weaponry since 1865. Léon Roches, French consul to Japan, supported the shogunal military reform efforts to promote French influence, hoping to make Japan into a dependent client state. This caused the British to send their own military mission to compete with the French. Despite the bombardment of Kagoshima, the Satsuma domain had become closer to the British and was pursuing the modernization of its army and navy with their support. The Scottish merchant Thomas Blake Glover sold quantities of warships and guns to the southern domains. American and British military experts, usually former officers, may have been directly involved in this military effort. The British ambassador, Harry Smith Parkes, supported the anti-shogunate forces in a drive to establish a legitimate, unified imperial rule in Japan and to counter French influence with the shogunate. During that period, southern Japanese leaders such as Saigo Takamori of Satsuma or Ito Hirobumi and Inoue Kaoru of Choshu cultivated personal connections with British diplomats, notably Ernest Mason Satow. Satsuma Domain received British assistance for their naval modernization, and they became the second largest purchaser of Western ships after the shogunate itself, of which nearly all were British built. As Satsuma samurai became dominant in the Imperial Navy after the war, the Navy frequently sought assistance from the British. In preparation for future conflict, the shogunate also modernized its forces. In line with Parkes' strategy, the British, previously the shogunate's primary foreign partner, proved reluctant to provide assistance. The Tokugawa thus came to rely mainly on French expertise, comforted by the military prestige of Napoleon III at that time, acquired through his successes in the Crimean War and the Second Italian War of Independence. The shogunate took major steps towards the construction of a modern and powerful military. A navy with a corps of 8 steam warships had been built over several years and was already the strongest in Asia. In 1865, Japan's first modern naval arsenal was built in Yokosuka by the French engineer Léonce Verny. In January 1867, a French military mission arrived to reorganize the shogunate army and create the Denshutai elite force, and an order was placed with the U.S. to buy the French-built ironclad warship CSS Stonewall, which had been built for the Confederate States Navy during the American Civil War. Due to the Western powers' declared neutrality, the U.S. refused to release the ship. But once neutrality was lifted, the Imperial faction obtained the vessel and employed it in engagements in Hakodate under the name Kotetsu, ironclad, coup d'etat. Following a coup d'etat within Choshu, which returned to power the extremist factions opposed to the shogunate, the shogunate announced its intention to lead a second Choshu expedition to punish the renegade domain. This, in turn, prompted Choshu to form a secret alliance with Satsuma. In the summer of 1866, the shogunate was defeated by Choshu, leading to a considerable loss of authority. In late 1866, however, first shogun Tokugawa Iemochi and then Emperor Komei died and were succeeded by Tokugawa Yoshinobu and Emperor Meiji, respectively. These events, in the words of historian Marius Johnson, made a truce inevitable. On November 9, 1867, a secret order was created by Satsuma and Choshu in the name of Emperor Meiji, commanding the slaughtering of the traitorous subject Yoshinobu. Just prior to this, however, and following a proposal from the daimyo of the Tosa domain, Yoshinobu resigned his post and authority to the emperor, agreeing to be the instrument for carrying out imperial orders. This ended the Tokugawa shogunate. While Yoshinobu's resignation had created a nominal void at the highest level of government, his apparatus of state continued to exist. Moreover, the shogunate government, the Tokugawa family in particular, remained a prominent force in the evolving political order and retained many executive powers. Sato speculated that Yoshinobu had agreed to an assembly of daimyos on the hope that such a body would restore him, a prospect hardliners from Satsuma and Choshu found intolerable. Events came to a head on January 3, 1868, when these elements seized the imperial palace in Kyoto, and the following day had the 15-year-old Emperor Meiji declare his own restoration to full power. Although the majority of the Imperial Consultative Assembly, representing all the domains, was happy with the formal declaration of direct rule by the imperial court and tended to support a continued collaboration with the Tokugawa under the concept of just government, kokuseitai, Saigo Takamori threatened the assembly into abolishing the title shogun and ordering the confiscation of Yoshinobu's lands. Although he initially agreed to these demands, on January 17, 1868, Yoshinobu declared that he would not be bound by the Restoration Proclamation and called for its repeal. On January 24th, he decided to prepare an attack on Kyoto, which was occupied by Satsuma and Choshu forces. This decision was prompted by his learning of a series of arsons in Edo, starting with the burning of the outer works of Edo Castle, the main Tokugawa residence. This was blamed on Satsuma Ronin, who on that day attacked a government office. The next day, shogunate forces responded by attacking the Edo residence of the daimyo of Satsuma, where many opponents of the shogunate, under Saigo's direction, had been hiding and creating trouble. The residence was burned down, and many opponents killed or later executed. Weapons and uniforms. The forces of Choshu and Satsuma were fully modernized with Armstrong guns, Minié rifles, and one Gatling gun. The shogunate forces had been slightly lagging in terms of equipment, although the French military mission had recently trained a core elite force. The shogun also relied on troops supplied by allied domains, which were not necessarily as advanced in terms of military equipment and methods, composing an army that had both modern and outdated elements. Individual guns, numerous types of more or less modern muskets and rifles, were imported from countries as varied as France, Germany, the Netherlands, Britain, and the United States, and coexisted with traditional types such as the Tanegashima matchlock. Most shogunate troops used smoothbore muskets, about 200,000 of which had been imported or domestically produced over the years since around 1600. The first modern firearms were initially imported about 1840 from the Netherlands by the pro-Western reformist Takashima Shuhan. The daimyo of Nagaoka Domain, however, an ally of the shogun, possessed 2 Gatling guns and several thousand modern rifles. The shogunate is known to have placed an order for 30,000 modern Dries needle guns in 1866. Napoleon III provided Yoshinobu with 2,000 state-of-the-art Chassepot rifles, which he used to equip his personal guard. Antiquated Tanegashima matchlocks are also known to have been used by the shogunate, however. Meanwhile, Aizu troops used the Bavarian M1842 musket. Imperial troops mainly used Minié rifles, which were much more accurate, lethal, and had a much longer range than the imported smoothbore muskets. Although, being also muzzle loading, they were similarly limited to 2 shots per minute. Improved breech loading mechanisms, such as the Snyder, developing a rate of about 10 shots a minute, are known to have been used by Choshu troops against the shogunate's Shogutai regiment at the Battle of Ueno in July 1868. In the second half of the conflict in the Northeast Theater, Tosa troops are known to have used American-made Spencer repeating rifles. American-made handguns were also popular, such as the 1863 Smith & Wesson Army No. 2, which was imported to Japan by Glover and used by Satsuma forces. Artillery. For artillery, wooden cannons, only able to fire 3 or 4 shots before bursting, coexisted with state-of-the-art Armstrong guns using explosive shells. Armstrong guns were efficiently used by Satsuma and Saga troops throughout the war. The shogunate, as well as the imperial side, also used native Japanese cannons, with Japan making cannons domestically as far back as 1575. Warships. In the area of warships also, some of the most recent ironclads, such as the Kotetsu, coexisted with older types of steamboats and even traditional sailboats. The shogunate initially had the edge in warships, and it had the vision to buy the French-built Kotetsu from the United States in 1867. The ship was blocked from delivery by foreign powers on grounds of neutrality once the conflict had started, and was ultimately delivered to the Imperial faction shortly after the Battle of Toba Fushimi. Uniforms. Uniforms were Western style for modernized troops, usually dark, with variations in the shape of the helmet. Tall conical for Satsuma, flat conical for Choshu, rounded for the shogunate. Officers of the shogunate often wore French and British uniforms. Traditional troops, however, retained their samurai clothes. Some of the imperial troops wore peculiar headgear, involving the use of long, colored, bear hair. The red bear, Shiguma wigs, indicated officers from Tosa, the white bear, Haguma wigs, officers from Choshu, and the black bear, Koguma, wigs officers from Satsuma. Status of combatants, shogunate forces, Sanpeitai. The Sanpeitai formed a more extensive attempt at modernization, with it being introduced in 1862 by graduates of Sakun samurai academies. The attempt called for the raising of a standing army from the shogun's personal lands, tenryo, and the daimyo under their feudal obligations to provide troops to the shogun. The army known as the Sanpeitai, or alternatively the Shine Jobigun, was supposed to number 13,625 men with 8,300 infantry, 2,000 with rifles, 1,068 cavalry, 900 with rifles, 4,890 artillerymen with 48 8-pound field guns and 52 16-pound siege guns and 1 406 officers. The force was to contain half Seishi, richer samurai, and half Kashi, poorer samurai. The recruitment was to be men between 17 and 45, with service terms of 5 years, with battalions of 600 companies of 120 and platoons of 40. The daimyo were allowed to substitute manpower with money to purchase firearms and rice to feed the soldiers, something the shogunate desperately needed both of. However, the plan immediately ran into issues as resistance to providing men and money to purchase firearms was met by the shogun. Ironically, the largest provider of men under the new system was the Satsuma domain, providing 4,800 infantry, 100 cavalry, and 8 guns with 100 men. In 1863, the shogun allowed the recruitment of commoners, but by 1867, this force had only reached 5,900 infantry. In order to augment this force, the shogun raised 5 battalions of Yugekitai. The shogun also disbanded the city and legation guard units and added them to the Sanpatai, adding at least 1,500 men to the army. Other forces. The shogunate, aiming to modernize its forces, hired 17 French officers in 1867. These 17 officers trained 900 men who formed the elite Denshutai. The French officers brought with them 3,000 chassepot rifles and 12 artillery pieces. 3 separate military schools were constructed for the infantry, artillery, and cavalry, with limited engineer instruction. They also introduced carbine and lance cavalry to the force. It was intended for the 900 men of the Denshutai to be dispersed amongst the myriad of shogunate armies to train and reorganize them, though this did not occur due to the outbreak of hostilities. The shogun additionally possessed 302 Shinsengumi police forces who were intensely loyal to the shogunate. The shogunate navy also contained 3,000 sailors who acted as infantry on Hokkaido towards the end of the war. Imperial forces, Satsuma. The Satsuma domain in 1840 contained 25,000 samurai, and being more open to the world at large, underwent a more rapid process of modernization than the shogunate. In 1854, a foundry was already founded for firearms production, soon joined by an artillery foundry and 3 ammunition plants. The Anglo-Satsuma War of 1863 gave the Satsuma officials a further incentive for more extensive military reforms due to the poor military performance of its forces. The daimyo therefore hired several French officers and began enrolling peasants into the military, Choshu. The Choshu domain in 1840 contained 11,000 samurai and was also more amenable to reform and more ambitious than Satsuma in reform and the recruitment of peasantry with the formation of the 300-strong Kihetai, a mixed formation of samurai, townsmen, and peasants, with Ronin officers with tough discipline and Western uniforms. A 2nd and 3rd company was raised, increasing its strength to 900 men. The usage of gunboat diplomacy brought in many volunteers, and another 980 men were formed in several shotai, or auxiliary militia, with 60 units in total by 1865. These shotai were added to the Choshu military and given modern weaponry by 1868. By 1868, there were 150 shotai, and they were regularized. And when added to the regular domain, army contained a total of 36 infantry battalions, amounting to 14,400 men, which formed the core of the pro-imperial army when war broke out. Imperial military. In April 1868, Emperor Meiji himself called for the dispatch of 60 men per 10,000 koku, 150 kilograms of rice, the amount needed for a man for 1 year. Produced in his domain, of the 60-man drafts, 1/6 were to be sent to Kyoto to form an imperial army, and the remaining 50 to garrison the daimyo's domain. Opening conflicts. On January 27, 1868, shogunate forces attacked the forces of Choshu and Satsuma, clashing near Toba and Fushimi at the southern entrance to Kyoto in the Battle of Toba-Fushimi. Some parts of the 15,000-strong shogunate forces had been trained by French military advisors. Among their numbers during this battle were the noted Shinsengumi. The forces of Choshu and Satsuma were outnumbered 3.1, but fully modernized with Armstrong howitzers, Minier rifles, and a few Gatling guns. After an inconclusive start, an imperial banner was presented to the defending troops on the second day, and a relative of the emperor, Ninnaji Yoshiaki, was named nominal commander-in-chief, making the forces officially an imperial army, Kongun. Moreover, convinced by courtiers, several local daimyos, up to this point faithful to the shogun, started to defect to the side of the imperial court. These included the daimyos of Yodo and Tsu in February, tilting the military balance in favor of the imperial side. After the defections, Yoshinobu, apparently distressed by the imperial approval given to the actions of Satsuma and Choshu, fled Osaka aboard the Japanese battleship Kaio Maru, withdrawing to Edo. Demoralized by his flight and by the betrayal by Yodo and Tsu, shogunate forces retreated, resulting in an imperial victory. Although it is often considered the shogunate forces should have won the encounter. Osaka Castle was soon invested on March 1st, February 8th in the Tenpo calendar, putting an end to the battle. The day after the Battle of Toba Fushimi commenced, the naval battle of Awa took place between the shogunate and elements of the Satsuma Navy in Awa Bay near Osaka. This was Japan's second engagement between two modern navies. The battle, although small in scale, ended with a victory for the shogunate. On the diplomatic front, the ministers of foreign nations gathered in the open harbor of Hyogo, present-day Kobe, in early February, issued a declaration according to which the shogunate was still considered the only rightful government in Japan, giving hope to Tokugawa Yoshinobu that foreign nations, especially France, might consider an intervention in his favor. A few days later, however, an imperial delegation visited the ministers, declaring that the shogunate was abolished, that harbors would be open in accordance with international treaties, and that foreigners would be protected. The ministers finally decided to recognize the new government. The rise of anti-foreign sentiment nonetheless led to several attacks on foreigners in the following months. 11 French sailors from the corvette Dupleix were killed by samurai of Tosa in the Sakai incident on March 8, 1868. 15 days later, Sir Harry Parkes, the British ambassador, was attacked by a group of samurai in a street of Kyoto, surrender of Edo. Beginning in February, with the help of the French ambassador Léon Roches, a plan was formulated to stop the imperial court's advance at Odawara, the last strategic entry point to Edo, but Yoshinobu decided against the plan. Shocked, Léon Roches resigned from his position. In early March, under the influence of the British minister Harry Parkes, foreign nations signed a strict neutrality agreement, according to which they could not intervene or provide military supplies to either side until the resolution of the conflict. Saigo Takamori led the victorious imperial forces north and east through Japan, winning the Battle of Koshu Katsunuma. He eventually surrounded Edo in May 1868, leading to its unconditional defeat after Katsu Kaishu, the shogun's army minister, negotiated the surrender. Some groups continued to resist after this surrender, but were defeated in the Battle of Ueno on July 4, 1868. Meanwhile, the leader of the shogun's navy, Inamoto Takeyaki, refused to surrender all his ships. He remitted just 4 ships, among them the Fujiyama, but he then escaped north with the remnants of the shogun's navy, 8 steam warships, Kaiten, Banryu, Chiodagata, Choge, Kaio Maru, Kanrin Maru, Mikaho, and Shinsoku, and 2,000 personnel, in the hope of staging a counterattack together with the northern daimyos. He was accompanied by a handful of French military advisors, notably Jules Brunet, who had formally resigned from the French army to accompany the rebels. Resistance of the Northern Coalition. After Yoshinobu's surrender, he was placed under house arrest and stripped of all titles, land, and power. He was later released when he demonstrated no further interest and ambition in national affairs. He retired to Shizuoka, the place to which his ancestor, Tokugawa Ieyasu, had also retired. Most of Japan accepted the emperor's rule, but a core of domains in the north, supporting the Aizu clan, continued the resistance. In May, several northern daimyos formed an alliance to fight imperial troops. The coalition of northern domains composed primarily of forces from the domains of Sendai, Yonezawa, Aizu, Shonai, and Nagaoka domain, with a total of 50,000 troops. Apart from those core domains, most of the northern domains were part of the alliance. In May 1868, the daimyo of Nagaoka inflicted high losses on the imperial troops in the Battle of Hokkaido, but his castle ultimately fell on May 19th. Imperial troops continued to progress north, defeating the Shinsengumi at the Battle of Bonari Pass, which opened the way for their attack on the castle of Aizu Wakamatsu in the Battle of Aizu in October 1868, thus making the position in Sendai untenable. Inamoto's fleet reached Sendai Harbor on August 26th. Although the Northern Coalition was numerous, it was poorly equipped and relied on traditional fighting methods. Modern armament was scarce, and last-minute efforts were made to build cannons made of wood and reinforced with roping, firing stone projectiles. Such cannons, installed on defensive structures, could only fire 4 or 5 projectiles before bursting. On the other hand, the daimyo of Nagaoka managed to procure 2 of the 3 Gatling guns in Japan and 2,000 modern French rifles from the German weapons dealer Henry Schnell. The coalition crumbled, and on October 12, 1868, the fleet left Sendai for Hokkaido. After having acquired 2 more ships, Oi and Hu, previously borrowed by Sendai from the shogunate, and about 1,000 more troops, remaining shogunate troops under Otori Keisuke, Shinsengumi troops under Hijikata Toshizo, the guerrilla corps, Yugekitai, under Hitomi Katsutaro, as well as several more French advisors, Fortant, Garde, Marlin, Bouffier. On October 26th, Edo was renamed Tokyo, and the Meiji period officially started. Aizu was besieged starting that month, leading to the mass suicide of the Byakutai, White Tiger Corps, young warriors. After a protracted month-long battle, Aizu finally admitted defeat on November 6th, Hokkaido Campaign, creation of the Ezo Republic. Following defeat on Honshu, Enomoto Takeaki fled to Hokkaido with the remnants of the navy and his handful of French advisors. Together, they organized a government with the objective of establishing an independent island nation dedicated to the development of Hokkaido. They formally established the Republic of Ezo on the American model, Japan's only ever republic, and Enomoto was elected as president, with a large majority. The Republic tried to reach out to foreign legations present in Hakodate, such as the Americans, French, and Russians, but was not able to garner any international recognition or support. Enomoto offered to confer the territory to the Tokugawa shogun under imperial rule, but his proposal was declined by the Imperial Governing Council. During the winter, they fortified their defenses around the southern peninsula of Hakodate, with the new fortress of Goryokaku at the center. The troops were organized under a Franco-Japanese command, the commander-in-chief, Otori Keisuke, being seconded by the French captain Jules Brunet, and divided between 4 brigades. Each of these was commanded by a French non-commissioned officer, Fortant, Marlin, Cazeneuve, Bouffier, and were themselves divided into 8 half-brigades, each under Japanese command. Final losses and surrender. The Imperial Navy reached the harbor of Miyako on March 20th, but anticipating the arrival of the Imperial ships, the Ezo rebels organized a daring plan to seize the Kotetsu. Led by Shinsengumi commander Hijikata Toshizo, 3 warships were dispatched for a surprise attack in what is known as the Battle of Miyako Bay. The battle ended in failure for the Tokugawa side, owing to bad weather, engine trouble, and the decisive use of a Gatling gun by Imperial troops against samurai boarding parties. Imperial forces soon consolidated their hold on mainland Japan, and in April 1869, dispatched a fleet and an infantry force of $7,000 to Izo, starting the Battle of Hakodate. The Imperial forces progressed swiftly and won the naval engagement at Hakodate Bay, Japan's first large-scale naval battle between modern navies, and the fortress of Goryokaku was surrounded. Seeing the situation had become desperate, the French advisors escaped to a French ship stationed in Hakodate Bay, Coët Logon, under the command of Abel Nicolas Bergas du Petit Thouars, from where they were shipped back to Yokohama and then France. The Japanese requested that the French advisors be given judgment in France. However, due to popular support in France for their actions, the former French advisors were not punished for their actions. Invited to surrender, Enomoto at first refused, and sent the naval codes he had brought back from Holland to the general of the imperial troops, Kuroda Kiyotaka, to prevent their loss. Otori Keisuke convinced him to surrender, telling him that deciding to live through defeat is the truly courageous way. Dying is easy, you can do that anytime. Enomoto surrendered on June 27, 1869, accepting Emperor Meiji's rule, and the Izo Republic ceased to exist. Aftermath. Of the approximately 120,000 men mobilized over the course of the conflict, about 8,200 were killed and more than 5,000 were wounded. Following victory, the new government proceeded with unifying the country under a single, legitimate, and powerful rule by the imperial court. The emperor's residence was effectively transferred from Kyoto to Edo at the end of 1868, and the city renamed to Tokyo. The military and political power of the domains was progressively eliminated, and the domains themselves were transformed in 1871 into prefectures, whose governors were appointed by the emperor. A major reform was the effective expropriation and abolition of the samurai class, allowing many samurai to change into administrative or entrepreneurial positions, but forcing many others into poverty. The southern domains of Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa, having played a decisive role in the victory, occupied most of the key posts in government for several decades following the conflict, a situation sometimes called the Meiji oligarchy and formalized with the institution of the Genro. In 1869, the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo was built in honor of the victims of the Boshin War. Some leading partisans of the former shogun were imprisoned, but narrowly escaped execution. This clemency derives from the insistence of Saigo Takamori and Iwakura Tomomi, although much weight was placed on the advice of Parkes, the British envoy. He had urged Saigo, in the words of Ernest Satow, that severity towards Keiki, Yoshinobu, or his supporters, especially in the way of personal punishment, would injure the reputation of the new government in the opinion of European powers. After 2 or 3 years of imprisonment, most of them were called to serve the new government, and several pursued brilliant careers. Enomoto Takeaki, for instance, would later serve as an envoy to Russia and China, and as the education minister. The imperial side did not pursue its objective of expelling foreign interests from Japan, but instead shifted to a more progressive policy, aiming at the continued modernization of the country and the renegotiation of unequal treaties with foreign powers, later under the rich country, strong army, Fukoku Kyohei motto. The shift in stance towards foreigners came during the early days of the Civil War. On April 8, 1868, new signboards were erected in Kyoto, and later throughout the country, that specifically repudiated violence against foreigners. During the course of the conflict, Emperor Meiji personally received European envoys, first in Kyoto, then later in Osaka and Tokyo. Also unprecedented was Emperor Meiji's reception of Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, in Tokyo, as his equal in point of blood. Although the early Meiji era witnessed a warming of relations between the imperial court and foreign powers, relations with France temporarily soured due to the initial support by France for the shogun. Soon, however, a second military mission was invited to Japan in 1874 and a third one in 1884. A high level of interaction resumed around 1886, when France helped build the Imperial Japanese Navy's first large-scale modern fleet, under the direction of naval engineer Louis-Émile Bertin. The modernization of the country had started during the last years of the shogunate, and the Meiji government ultimately adopted the same policy. Upon his coronation, Meiji issued his charter oath, calling for deliberative assemblies, promising increased opportunities for the common people, abolishing the evil customs of the past, and seeking knowledge throughout the world to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule. The reforms culminated in the 1889 issuance of the Meiji Constitution. However, despite the support given to the imperial court by samurai, many of the early Meiji reforms were seen as detrimental to their interests. The creation of a conscript army made of commoners, as well as the loss of hereditary prestige and stipends, antagonized many former samurai. Tensions ran particularly high in the south, leading to the 1874 Saga Rebellion and a rebellion in Choshu in 1876. Former samurai in Satsuma, led by Saigo Takamori, who had left government over foreign policy differences, started the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, fighting for the maintenance of the samurai class and a more virtuous government. It ended with a heroic but total defeat at the Battle of Shiroyama, later depictions. In modern summaries, the Meiji Restoration is often described as a bloodless revolution leading to the sudden modernization of Japan. The facts of the Boshin War, however, clearly show that the conflict was quite violent. About 120,000 troops were mobilized altogether, with roughly 3,500 known casualties during open hostilities, but much more during terrorist attacks. Although traditional weapons and techniques were used, both sides employed some of the most modern armaments and fighting techniques of the period, including the ironclad warship, Gatling guns, and fighting techniques learned from Western military advisors. Such Japanese depictions include numerous dramatizations, spanning many genres. Notably, Jiro Asada wrote a 4-volume novel of the account, Mibu Gishiden, a film adaptation of Asada's work, directed by Yojiro Takita, is known as When the Last Sword is Drawn. A 10-hour 2002 television jidaigeki based on the same novel starred Ken Watanabe. A Japanese manga series, Rurouni Kenshin, by Nobuhiro Watsuki, notably takes place during the war and its aftermath. Western interpretations include the 2003 American film The Last Samurai, directed by Edward Zwick, which combines into a single narrative historical situations belonging both to the Boshin War, the 1877 Satsuma Rebellion, and other similar uprisings of ex-samurai during the early Meiji period. The elements of the movie pertaining to the early modernization of Japan's military forces, as well as the direct involvement of foreign, mostly French, forces, relate to the Boshin War and the few years leading to it. However, the suicidal stand of traditionalist samurai forces, led by Saigo Takamori, against the modernized imperial army, relate to the much later Satsuma Rebellion. The main campaign in the 2012 expansion to Creative Assembly's game Total War, Shogun 2, Fall of the Samurai, depicts the Boshin War. Players can choose from various historical clans, such as the Imperial Satsuma or the shogunate Aizu. That's the complete article. If you made it this far, you'll love the rest of the channel. Subscribe for a new Wikipedia deep dive every single day. The next video is on screen now, and if there's a topic you want narrated, drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching.